Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 2, Chapter 8, Section 4, Zini Ore and Clay. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny, Zongjun,
Hey.
and our newest editor, Emily Huang.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome, Pat, Zongjun, and Emily. We're happy to have you as a new member. Before we begin this chapter, a brief introduction. Emily, you were a former member of the Tea Institute at Penn State. What did you do your research on in the Institute?
Yes, I was a former member, and in fact, I was taught by the great Pat and
What?
Pat's lineage, yes. And yeah, most of my research has surrounded some translation work from either mostly Chinese books into English.
That was very, very helpful at the time. Yeah, it's not so dissimilar from what you might be working on here on the Tea Technique team. We're happy to have you. Actually, like the rest of us, you are in the food and beverage industry. You work in product development, right?
I used to work more centered in the food and beverage industry, more on the manufacturing side. And now I work on the consulting side of things, but I still serve the greater FMCG, which includes the food and beverage industry right now.
At one time, Emily and I were fighting head to head. I was doing products for coffee in Japan, and she was doing products for a large competitor,
Yes,
actually a much bigger company.
No, yeah. What used to be sensei Seito relationship, just head on head competition.
And just
Well, Emily was in marketing.
Little relationship turns out to be a battle at the end.
Yeah, Emily was in marketing, so I think she won that battle.
Ooh.
Amazing. My first question, is Zini an overlooked clay in comparison to Hongni and Zhuni? We so rarely hear odes to the greatness of Zini. Why do the red clay wares receive the majority of praise and attention?
It is a really good question, and it's a hard question. I don't know why, but it is something I've observed as well. I think predominantly social media platforms, Instagram, you see a lot of people posting old Zuni pots. You see, a lot of late Qing, early ROC Zuni, lots of poetic descriptions about the texture of the skin. People go on and on about some specific shapes and makers, and I don't feel like I've seen the same just long-winded poetic posts about Zuni of any sort. And often nowadays, a lot of the kind of standard, more basic pots that you can find online from a lot of decently reputable vendors often kind of start in the Zuni category. And maybe sometimes you'll have things that get a little more specific, like you'll get a Cao Qing available. But it's really hard to say why. I feel like maybe there's a little bit of some color psychology going on there where, these Zuni pots are kind of just brown and a little more earthy and they don't stand out as much. And Zuni really has this, Hongni really have kind of a little bit more of a brightness that catches the eye, but never thought about it. It's a fascinating question.
Yeah, my gut suspicion is that the hype of really dive into Zini has passed, and we are just living in a era that people starting shifting from Zini to Zuni. Because, back in the days, Zini was like the go-to clay when you want to purchase any zisha wares. Like the name zisha was originally came from the influence of Zini. And for all of the older wares, oftentimes you see like Cao Qing, you see wares made out of Tian Qing Ni, all under the Zini category. But right now, all of the highest quality Zini has been deprived. I think it's quite natural for the market and people's attention to shift from Zini to other types of clay.
Emily, do you think it's the commonality? Like, is it just that Zini is the most common zisha and thus it gets relegated to a lesser category?
What do you mean by the commonality?
It's the most common as a percentage of mine output. Majority of zisha wares are made of Zini or blended with Zini.
But why would that make it the most popular? Because that would be the least rare, right? I don't know. And my go-to sense was usually a little bit more desired when it's a little bit more rare and fewer supply, higher demand kind of thing.
It was the Taiwanese that originally started I don't know if I should say over focus, but the initial focus on particularly Zuni wares. That was Taiwanese scholars, Taiwanese collectors who said that Zuni is dyed of zisha. Do you believe that still plays a role in the over focus on red clay wares versus Zini?
I don't think it still plays as much as a role, but because of the limited information that we have going around in this world, it could still be to an extent.
Going back real quick, I think, Emily had a good point around the supply and demand and kind of rarity, right? So I think any clay that is perceived as rarer, particularly nowadays with just the way that we share information through social media, I think that rarity and that hype has some kind of value. And so it makes sense that if Zuni was commonly available, people aren't going to flaunt their Zuni pots as much because everyone kind of has one, even if we don't all have super amazing ones. But on the Taiwanese collector piece, I do wonder, as the focus in the market, let's say predominantly around like the late 2000s into the 2010s, really started shifting even in the Western market towards pu'er, and the focus really moved towards pu'er right around the time that I, was really getting into tea. With the Taiwanese having such a particularly special stockhold of old pu'ers, I wonder how much of the focus on and shift towards that kind of tea also had global team members' focuses shifting towards other Taiwanese inclinations, such as red clays, Zuni, Hongni.
Yeah, also for the highest quality Zini, like contemporary Tian Qing Ni, it's still in very high demand, and people still regard it as a very high quality and fancy clay to have. So I think Emily does have a point that there's a supply demand issue going on right here. And for all the fancy variation underneath each clay category, I think it's still being regarded highly.
But would you say that for the global market or the Western market, or are you talking only specifically for the Chinese market? Because I certainly think that Zini is more sought after in the mainland market than it is in the Western market.
Yeah, I would agree on that too. I was thinking about domestic market when I was assessing this.
So do we think that the underfocus or the overfocus on red clay wares is actually just an artifact of the Western market? It's not true in China now? Because both Zongjun, you and Emily immediately said like, oh, I don't know if that's a thing. While Pat and I were like, yeah, weird, hard question. Why do all these Westerners focus on Zuni wares? So is this just an East-West split right now?
It seems so. Both hypes exist in the domestic market in China. But I think in the West, there seems to be a strong inclination towards Zuni other than Zini.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's other kind of markets around the mainland area, right? Like I feel like I do see quite a lot of Singaporeans, Malaysians that are focusing on some red clay wares, whereas maybe in the mainland, as you were saying, Jason, the focus isn't there. Zongjun did just land, yesterday from China. So I think he's got a pretty great perspective on it. Welcome back to the US, Zongjun.
Thanks.
Now you can actually drink tea while we have these conversations.
Yeah, Emily's still stuck in a pretty late time zone. Sorry.
I don't know if I would say stuck. Emily, we want to trade.
That's true, in Taiwan, yeah.
Yeah, definitely not stuck. I, for one thing, get more tea resources and faster than any of you.
That's true. Jason and I are both waiting on some tea shipments. If we were in Taiwan, we'd have them in our hands.
Follow up on this topic. A long, long time ago in a place far, far away, all of us here believed that we knew something about Yixing, I think. And yet, before undertaking this book, we would have been mystified at the variations of Zini. Unlike Zuni and Hongni, the variations within Zini were very rarely discussed at the time. So why were we so late in learning about these variations? Why were we so late in learning about Cao Qing and Tian?
Just considering, Jason and I had started studying with you and with our various teachers, the earliest out of everyone on here, I feel like the frameworks that the teachers that we studied under, that they brought in regards to Yixing and Zisha clay were very different than the kind of frameworks that you now through this research are starting to unpack. The kind of subdivisions like we're seeing here, Tian Qing Ni, Cao Qing, Qing Shui Ni. These are things that maybe in the past 5 or 6 years on the Western facing, internet, you could start to find more discussion of these. But I think when you and I had first started studying Yixing, if you searched for Yixing Zuni clay on the internet, you were going to find something that was just called Zuni. You were not going to find Tian Qing Ni. Like that didn't exist on the Western facing market 10 years ago. It does seem that there are multiple frameworks for approaching Zisha clay. And it just seems that now with the writing of this book, we're tapping into potentially the most accurate one as it relates to the physical materials. I'm interested to hear everyone else's thoughts, though. When we were first learning about Yixing, we never talked about any of these kind of subtypes. You guys are both Mandarin language speakers. As Jason and I were talking about Yixing, what were you guys thinking? Were these things you had heard about before?
Yeah, so Cao Qing and Tian Qing Ni are some of the older notion of Zini being categorized in the past. Contemporarily speaking, a lot of these Zini are heavily categorized based on their geographic identity, like different shaft mines or different mining sites. And it's quite rare to actually hear people referring certain wares made out of certain types of Zini from specific locations until maybe very, very recently, even in China.
Particularly if they're trying to sell you something.
Yeah. When they're being ultra specific, sometimes you really need to put a question mark on top of that. Wondering, okay, do you actually know the difference between shaft mine number 1 and shaft mine number 4 Zini from different strata?
Here's your Dashui Tan Tian Qing Ni. Look, you can tell it's Tian Qing Ni because of the remaining cat's eyes. Can't you see the little sparkle from the adjacency to marble?
And the 5% mica difference really makes a whole different world.
I just have to have the chapter table out, when I start going to shops at this point.
Point to which deposit was this from? Here's the table. Point.
Yeah, things no merchant knows.
No, certainly not.
So, Emily, I'm interested in your perspective. We all thought we knew something about Yixing when we were studying at the Tea Institute. And now I feel like I knew nothing.
Just like Zongjun and Pat mentioned, when we first started learning this, maybe there wasn't enough access to a lot of these information. And I still feel like there's a whole world out there. A lot of them could be hidden in more ancient excerpts. A lot of them could be fake or yet to be validated. And so a lot of it just needs a lot of time for us to learn as we go. But even in the Mandarin speaking world, I would say it doesn't make it any easier to find the right things. If anything, it's even more noise. Like Zongjun mentioned, there's more merchants. There's a lot of, especially with the ease of technology, everyone can post content. It could be called other names. So no, I definitely still feel like I know nothing.
Something we all learned, though, and I think continues to serve us today and to still folks of ours, beyond the scholarly work that we're putting out now, I think we did learn a good framework for approaching how to evaluate what teas work well with which clays. And that's something that I think can't be taught through specifically writing. But I do think through the book, Jason, you hope to provide a framework for people to do the same.
I agree. Our education at the Institute, both because of the access to the information we had, because of the method of pedagogy, and because of my knowledge and interests at the time, was very, very tasting focused. So we knew far less about the sub variation of ore. We knew far less about which mine anything came from, far less about pinpei and blending techniques. But we were very good at identifying this is an antique teapot, this is Duani, Hongni, Zhuni, or Zini, and this is the pairing that we have found. This is the effect of the clay on the tea. And I think that continues to serve us well, because we have said multiple times in the podcast and in the chapters, how do you use this information? Sometimes it's possible. Sometimes if you're sourcing, it's possible. But frequently when you're going to sit in your tea room, does it really matter if it's from shaft mine 1 versus shaft mine 2 or surface level mine versus mid-mountain mine? Only if you really know what you're collecting, what you're aiming for, or if you have a point of comparison. But if you go and you buy a good Yixing teapot, right, your goal needs to be, what are you going to use it with? What are you going to pair it with? And I don't think that our approach to that has changed that much since our time at the Institute.
Yeah, I think this is really a good mindset of collecting tea wares. You're collecting for what, essentially? For your usage, for drinking tea, or just for the sheer value that this teapot might increase over time and got sold for a better price in the auction.
Exactly. So, just flip it and start selling it for Maotai bottles. There we go.
I think the Lukin Maotai collab is going really well.
Oh my God. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it.
It's a big hype, but for the friends that have
millions of cups, it's insane.
Yeah, for my friends who have tried it back in China, they told me that the taste really smells like vomits after very intensive baijiu drinking dinner.
Oh, well, I mean, have you had cafe carato? Coffee and grappa is the at least in my mind, is what they based it off of. And I don't know anyone who willingly orders and drinks that.
Well, just think about the occasion, right? Like when you're going to Luckin, right? You're probably going to work. You're probably picking up a coffee and going to work, or you just came off a lunch break. Like, do you want to taste something that tastes like a work dinner, a sad work dinner? No.
Day drinking is the new hype.
Well, at least we don't have to worry about any productivity gains from China this month. We saw it spike due to AI, and now we saw it plummet due to Luckin coffee.
I got out in the right time, I guess.
Okay. How do you think about names shifting over time? Why does the definition change in every era? Why is it different in ROC and then in F1?
Well, a lot of the definition changed during F1 and Cultural Revolution era. People tend to redefine things, not just 自杀 or 自你, but also a lot of other things. Meaning shift of different terms happens all the time. And most of the time is for the convenience of manufacture and marketing and selling. So I feel like that this is what happened during the name shifting of Qing Ni throughout these eras, because this is what people can recognize. This is what they are able to produce at the time. So most likely they just stick with the name.
But the readoption of old names, this is something that's very, very culturally Chinese, taking something that has a history and a legacy to a name and saying like, that thing doesn't exist anymore. I'm going to take that name and use it for this new thing, which I think is good and I think deserving of a name that has a legacy and has history. And so you redefine. Yeah. Qing Ni has been redefined, what, 3 times, 4 times in this chapter?
Yeah, that's right. And also Tian Qing Ni too, like the legendary Tian Qing Ni probably don't exist at all. But for nowadays, they found similar feature of Zini from similar locations and they're coining that Tian Qing Ni. I think that, as you say, it's pretty common in Chinese history. Again, not just about Zini.
We talk about that a lot in book 1 as well. There's a certain capital to some of these names and the historical context that happened around them. And it lends it a type of authenticity that consumers are willing to pay a little bit more if they think that there is some cultural cachet behind an item that may or not really exist with that specific said item they're purchasing.
And one of the most interesting parts of this question is that temporality. Why does it happen in times of great changes, right? We see the redefinitions normally during an era of discovery of new materials or an era of exploration. So in ROC, greater access to various ores and mines, new blending techniques, and then in F1, greater mechanizations of the mines. How do we link these two concepts of the developmental work and the developmental history of the mine to this temporal liminality on the definitions of the materials themselves?
I think I continue to look at it as a marketing exercise. So I really see where you mentioned in each kind of era, we see these new frontiers as far as production methodologies, ore processing, mechanization. And with that, there's always an opportunity. And you probably just have savvy business people. I really doubt that it's craftsmen that really, or miners that go and say, wow, this is something so new. We need to sell this under a new name. I think there really is just in each of these eras, there's people who see that there's been a shift. They see there's an opportunity. There's probably an unmet need or a consumer who has money that is willing to buy things that are kind of new and seem to be pushing the boundaries. And so they have identified that and they go and they make a name for themselves. They make a new name on this clay and find a way to tie it back to something that might be important or lend authenticity to this new item, because something that's new is probably a little scary for some consumers. And so they make it sound like it's something that's always been around or something that's always been special. And it's just finding that opportunity.
Zongjun, do you want to defend Chinese culture from Pat's accusation of craven marketing?
I don't think that was the point that Pat trying to make.
I mean, it's not far off.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of agree with Pat that there's a big role of consumer recognition playing right here. That for Qing Ni, that's for the majority of the consumer, what they can recognize in the market, that they see Qing Ni as good, as single origin, as pure. And at the time, that's what the factory can manufacture. And they manufacture a certain type of clay. They coined the name Qing Ni. They give it a grading system. But inventing a new name was certainly probably going against a lot of the market recognition at the time. And educating the market can be hard too, especially during those eras where the consumer literacy rate was relatively low.
To be clear, I totally agree. My last question. We don't want to talk too much about pairing this early in the book and before our long-running experiments have been completed. Yet one of our commissioned sets is in Tian Qing Ni clay, contemporary Tian Qing Ni clay. What has been your experience, Pat and Zongjun, using Tian Qing Ni, and how does it compare to other Zinis you've used, both modern and antique?
We got to get Emily this set if you got extras, Jason. So I absolutely love this set. I do have a couple other Zini clay pots. I've got some Qing Ni. I do not own any Cao Qing to my knowledge. This set has been awesome. Not just the learning opportunities within the set, but the clay itself. I will say a lot of the pairings have been really good, and even pairings that I thought were less successful still had a net neutral at the most effect, or at the worst, rather. I have really been loving how this clay interacts with, roasted oolongs, with like mid-aged pu'er that still has a little bit of a punch. And that's a lot of the kind of teas that I drink. So I found this to be a very versatile teapot or clay, right, interaction with a lot of the teas that I want to be drinking.
Yeah, I totally agree with the effect of this clay to tea. And also, it's quite interesting to actually go to Yixing and talk to the ceramist and artist about the origin of this clay. And after having the discussion and also seeing comparison of other clays, I really had a pretty brand new understanding of what pure clay is supposed to be. Like for this Tian Qing Ni, it's not really pure in the sense of traditionally what people in the market would think of. It has some microchips, it has some residual of liquid, but for the ceramist and the artist in Yixing, that's what they consider as pure. It's natural. It doesn't undergo any acid wash. It doesn't undergo any intensive artificial selection. It's what it is. And it has good effect on tea, and it has good teapot construction. And that's what they prefer. And that's what we love about it too.
And now that we've sung the praise of Tian Qing Ni and all of our listeners are going to go out and try to buy Tian Qing Ni, how do we warn them against the Creole?
Yeah, there's a lot of very expensive Tian Qing Ni floating around on the internet, and how much of it is actually Tian Qing Ni and how much of it is storytelling, I don't know, but I don't think the split is in their favor either. I think I'm lucky enough, that since we have access and we have a source, I haven't really had to go out onto the internet and try and find Tian Qing Ni. But I think when I do, I'm going to need a little bit of help being less gullible to some of the marketing stories that I've seen.
Yeah, like if you Google or Baidu Tian Qing Ni /zisha on the internet, you're going to scroll through at least 10 pages of different vendor sites.
The best source is definitely Douyin.
Don't believe anything that is being sold as, over a certain age. I mean, anything that's Tian Qing Ni is going to be pretty contemporary. You're not going to get a historical Tian Qing Ni, and don't let the historicity of the name sell you on the product that you're about to buy, because it is unrelated, most likely.
Just in closing, I'll say that my pairing notes predominantly agree with Pat and Zongjun. I have a slight preference for my antique Hongni and Zhuni for roasted oolongs, although it's great in the Tian Qing Ni, but the mid-aged pu'ers in that have just been phenomenal. Thank you for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for our next conversation, Hongni, ore, and clay.